A furious millionaire arrives at the most expensive music school in the city to pick up his daughter, but discovers she hasn't attended classes. Desperate, he searches and finally finds her in the central square beside a barefoot street girl, playing an old violin with worn-out strings. As he approaches angrily to pull his daughter away, he suddenly stops upon hearing the melody the poor girl is teaching, a song that makes his heart stop. The black Mercedes skidded around the bend on Magnolia Lane, its tires protesting against the hot asphalt of that Friday. Edward Mendoza gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white as marble. His heart pounded wildly, each beat echoing in his ears like war drums. Where was Sophia? Where was his little girl? The grand conservatory of music stood majestically before him, with its Italian marble columns and perfectly manicured gardens. The scent of expensive instrument varnish floated through the air as piano scales mingled with violin chords emanating from the classrooms. It was a sanctuary for the musical elite, where each lesson cost more than many families' monthly income. Edward had personally chosen every teacher, every method, every detail of Sophia's musical education. His steps echoed down the main corridor like hammers. The secretary greeted him with her usual professional smile. But Edward didn't even see her. His mind was focused on one thing: finding his daughter and taking her home, where she would be safe under his protective control. "Professor August!" Edward barged into the violin room without knocking. The grey-haired man looked up, surprised by the sudden intrusion. "Mr. Mendoza, what a surprise. I thought you'd be picking Sophia up only at 5. Where is she?" Edward's voice came out rougher than he intended. "I need to take her now." The professor blinked, confused. "But Sophia didn't come today, sir. I thought maybe she was sick or—" The world seemed to tilt beneath Edward's feet. "What do you mean she didn't come? I dropped her off myself this morning. She said she'd come straight here after classes." "Mr. Mendoza, I checked the attendance list 3 times. Sophia Mendoza was not in class today." The professor showed an impeccably organized planner. "I tried to call to confirm, but..." Edward didn't wait for the explanation. He ran out into the corridors, his expensive Italian shoes striking furiously against the marble floor. His mind raced in 1,000 different directions. Sophia was an obedient girl. She would never miss classes without telling anyone. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The afternoon sun blinded him momentarily when he exited the building. His hands trembled as he dialed the number for Sophia's regular school. The principal confirmed the girl had left normally at 3 in the afternoon, carrying her backpack and the case for the new violin he'd bought in Germany. "Sophia! Sophia!" Edward yelled through the adjacent streets, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by. His $1,000 suit was soaked with sweat, but he didn't care. Nothing else existed but the desperate need to find his daughter. Running down Central Avenue, Edward felt his chest burn with every breath. Why had Sophia disappeared? Had something terrible happened? Had he failed as a protective father? The questions hammered his mind as his eyes scanned every corner, every face in the crowd. It was then that he saw her. In the town square, near the old fountain, a small, familiar silhouette was sitting on the marble steps. Sophia, in her impeccable school uniform and blonde hair tied in a ponytail, held her violin in her hands. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, a barefoot girl, in torn clothes and disheveled hair, held an old violin with visibly worn strings. The two were talking animatedly, as if they were old friends. Edward felt an explosive mixture of relief and fury wash over him. How dared Sophia worry him like that? How dared she miss her expensive music lessons to hang out on the street with an unknown girl? He marched towards the two, preparing for the scolding he would give Sophia. But when he was a few feet away, something made him stop completely. The street girl began to play a melody on the old violin. Edward felt his heart stop beating for a few eternal seconds. That music, that impossible melody, how could she be playing precisely that song? Edward stood paralyzed in the middle of the square, as if his feet had grown roots in the cobblestone pavement. The melody flowing from the street girl's worn violin was impossible, absolutely impossible. Each note pierced his chest like a sharp blade, unearthing memories he had meticulously buried years ago. It was Spring's Tears, the composition Helena used to play for him on warm summer nights, when they were still a passionate couple and the world seemed full of infinite possibilities. Helena, his ex-wife, the woman who had left, taking with her not only his dreams of a perfect family, but also the music that once filled every corner of his life. The girl played with an imperfect technique, but there was something in her interpretation that transcended any formal lesson. It was as if she understood every pause, every vibrato, every melodic sigh that made that piece more than just organized notes. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine when he recognized even the small flourishes Helena used to add, those personal variations that made the music unique. "Daddy!" Sophia ran towards him with a radiant smile, interrupting the musical trance he'd fallen into. "You're here! Daddy, you have to meet my new friend." Edward blinked several times, trying to return to the present. His daughter was safe and sound, but his mind still echoed with that impossible melody. How could a street child know such an intimate composition from his past life? "Sophia, you worried me. Why didn't you go to violin class?" His voice came out more controlled than he thought possible, considering the emotional turmoil he felt. "Sorry, Daddy, but I heard her playing when I was going to the conservatory and—" Sophia pointed to the girl, who had stopped playing and was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. "She plays much better than the teachers at that expensive school. You have to listen." The street girl couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. Her brown hair was tangled and dirty, her clothes a mix of patched-up pieces that had seen better days. But her eyes— Edward felt a strange unease looking into those eyes. There was something familiar about them, a depth that didn't match her apparent age. "What's your name?" Edward asked, crouching down to be at the girl's level. His voice sounded gentler than he intended. "We're Marina," she replied in a low voice, hugging the violin against her chest as if it were a precious treasure. "Sorry if I bothered you. I was just playing to earn some coins." Edward looked around and noticed an open violin case on the ground, with a few coins scattered. The reality of the situation hit him hard. That child was playing on the street to survive, using an instrument that looked at least 50 years old, and strings that threatened to snap at any moment. "Where did you learn that music?" The question came out before he could think better of it. Marina lowered her eyes, as if she'd done something wrong. "My mom taught me. She said it was a special song that someone very important to her used to love very much." Edward's heart gave an irregular leap. "Your mother, where is she now?" "At home, resting. She gets sick often and can't work properly." Marina hesitated for a moment. "That's why I play here, to buy medicine and food." Sophia tugged on her father's suit sleeve. "Daddy, can you buy new strings for her violin? She earns money playing on the street, but the strings are so old they're almost snapping. And look," Sophia pointed to the instrument. "Her violin must be very old, but the sound is beautiful when she plays." Edward observed the violin in Marina's hands with increasing attention. The varnish was worn by time and use, but the wood had the characteristic golden color of good quality antique instruments. There was something about that violin that sparked a hazy memory in his mind, something he couldn't quite identify. "Marina, could you play that song again?" Edward asked, ignoring the inner voice that screamed for him to run from there before more painful memories came to the surface. The music ceased, but the echo continued to reverberate in Edward's chest like waves on a calm lake. He opened his eyes slowly, feeling vulnerable and exposed in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Marina lowered the violin and stared at him with curiosity, as if trying to decipher the complex expression that had taken over his face. That was beautiful," Sophia clapped enthusiastically. "Daddy, did you see how well she plays? It's much better than those boring exercises the teachers make me repeat." Edward swallowed hard. His daughter was right in a disturbing way. Marina played with a soul he rarely saw in the technical and rigid lessons at the conservatory. There was genuine emotion in every note, a visceral connection to the music that transcended any formal teaching methodology. "Marina," Edward said, trying to keep his voice steady, "how long have you been playing violin?" "Ever since I can remember," she replied, affectionately running her fingers over the worn strings. "My mum started teaching me when I was very little. She said music was the most important thing she could give me." A pang of guilt shot through Edward's chest. He had given Sophia the best violin money could buy, the best lessons, the best teachers, but he had never sat down with her to simply share the love of music. Everything was about technique, discipline, perfection. When was the last time he truly listened to Sophia play for pleasure, not out of obligation? "And your mother? Does she still play?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself. Marina's face saddened. "She wanted to, but she sold her violin 2 years ago to pay the rent when she got very sick. She said I could use hers to keep learning and—" Marina hesitated, biting her lower lip. "And to play on the street when we needed money." Sophia looked at her father with those huge blue eyes she'd inherited from him. "Daddy, we can help, can't we? You always say we have more money than we need." Edward felt a lump in his throat. It was true that he had built an impressive financial empire, but when was the last time he had used his wealth for something beyond controlling and protecting his own family? When had he looked beyond his personal needs to see the real suffering around him? "Marina, where do you live?" Edward asked, trying to sound casual. "In St. Vincent's district near the old church." Marina replied hesitantly, as if she was afraid the information might cause problems. Edward knew the area. It was one of the poorer areas of the city, where small, poorly maintained houses huddled on narrow streets. The contrast with his mansion in the exclusive estates of the south side couldn't have been greater. "Daddy," Sophia tugged on his sleeve again, "can you buy new strings for Marina's violin? And maybe she could come over sometime so we could play together." Sophia's suggestion hit Edward like a lightning bolt. Bringing that girl into his home would mean opening his private life to a complete stranger. It would mean stepping out of his zone of absolute control and exposing himself to variables he couldn't predict or manipulate. But there was something in Marina's eyes that prevented him from saying no immediately, a silent determination, a dignity that transcended her torn clothes and bare feet. She wasn't begging or showing self-pity. She was simply living, doing what she needed to do to survive with the only skill she possessed. "The strings," Edward said slowly. "Where can I buy suitable strings for your violin?" Marina's eyes widened in surprise. "There's an instrument shop on Commerce Street, but they're very expensive. I've been saving for months, but I haven't gathered enough money yet." Edward took his wallet from his inner suit pocket. He pulled out some bills and held them out to Marina. "I'll buy the strings and whatever else you need for the violin." Marina looked at the money as if it were something mystical. I can't accept it without giving anything in return." "You already have," Edward said, surprised by his own words. "You reminded me of something I had forgotten." Sophia smiled radiantly and hugged her father. "Thank you, Daddy. Now Marina can play even better." But as he watched Marina carefully put away the money, Edward felt something deeper happening there. That wasn't just an isolated good deed. It was the first step towards discoveries that could change everything he thought he knew about his life. Throughout the next week, Edward couldn't get Marina out of his thoughts. While reviewing multi-million-dollar contracts in his 40th floor office, his mind constantly returned to that impossible melody and the familiar eyes of the street girl. There was something there he needed to understand, a puzzle piece that refused to fit into his ordered understanding of the world. On Thursday, He made a decision that surprised him. He discreetly hired a private investigator. "I need information about a family living in St. Vincent's district," Edward told the middle-aged man sitting at his desk. "A woman who teaches music and her daughter, a girl named Marina." The investigator, Mr. Carter, was known for his discretion and efficiency. "Any specific information you'd like me to prioritize?" Edward hesitated. How to explain he was investigating a child because she played a song his ex-wife used to play? Just general information, financial situation, family history, that sort of thing. 3 days later, the report was in his hands. Edward read it alone in his office, with the curtains drawn and the door locked, as if he were dealing with top-secret documents. The woman's name was Eleanor Vasquez, a music teacher, graduated from the state conservatory. She had worked in private schools until 3 years ago, when health problems began to affect her ability to keep a steady job. She currently lived off sporadic lessons and temporary work whenever her condition allowed. Edward felt his stomach clench when he read the address: Almond Tree Lane, 247, apartment 3B. It was the same street where Helena had lived right after the divorce, before completely disappearing from his life. A coincidence? Edward didn't believe in coincidences. The report continued. Eleanor had a 9-year-old adopted daughter, Marina Vasquez, officially registered 6 years ago. The girl attended the neighborhood public school when she didn't need to miss class to help with family income by playing violin on the downtown streets. Adopted. The word flashed in his mind like a warning sign. Why would a woman in financial difficulty adopt a child? And why precisely then, 6 years ago, when Helena had disappeared from his life? On Friday, Edward made another impulsive decision. He told his secretary he was leaving early and drove to St. Vincent's district. He had no specific plan, just a growing need to understand what was happening. The contrast between his Mercedes and the narrow streets of the district was stark. Children played on cracked sidewalks, while women chatted in the doorways of small, colorful houses. Edward felt like an intruder in that world that operated at a completely different pace than his own. He found Almond Tree Lane without difficulty. Number 247 was an old 3-story building with peeling paint and windows that had seen better days. Edward stood in front of the building for several minutes without the courage to go up. That's when he saw her. A woman descended the stairs slowly, holding the railing as if she needed support. She was too thin, pale, with brown hair tied in a simple bun. She wore modest but clean clothes and carried a small sheet music bag. Edward felt the world spin around him. Even with a thinner face, even with the marks of time and hardship, he recognized her immediately. It was Helena, his ex-wife, the woman he had desperately searched for in the first years after their divorce, was there, just a few yards away, living in poverty while he built his financial empire. Helena walked down the street without noticing his presence, heading for the bus stop. Edward followed her from a distance, his heart pounding wildly. She moved carefully, like someone carrying constant physical pain, but maintained the upright posture he remembered so well. When the bus arrived and Helena boarded, Edward stood on the sidewalk, feeling as if he'd been punched in the gut. All his suspicions were confirmed at once, but now he had even more questions than answers. If Helena was alive and living there, if she was the one taking care of Marina, then who was that girl really? Why had Helena adopted her? And why had she taught the child precisely that music that connected them in the past? Edward returned to the car with trembling hands, knowing that his organized and controlled life was about to be completely transformed. Edward spent the entire weekend locked in his home office, ignoring calls from the company and Sophia's invitations to play together. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, questions, and contradictory emotions he didn't know how to process. Helena was alive. After all these years wondering where she might be, What might have happened to her? She was just a few miles away, living in conditions he had never imagined possible. On Monday, Edward could barely concentrate in meetings. His partners noticed his distraction, but he brushed it off, claiming to be analyzing a complex investment. How could he explain he was obsessed with a woman he'd sworn to forget years ago? During lunch, he called the private investigator again. "Mr. Carter, I need more information about Elena Vasquez, specifically about the last 6 years of her life. Of course, Mr. Mendoza, is there anything specific that piqued your interest?" Edward hesitated. "I want to know about the girl's adoption, how it happened, when, where, all possible details." On Tuesday, the supplementary report arrived with information that left Edward even more disturbed. Marina had been found at 3 years old, abandoned in a public hospital with a note that simply said, "Please take care of her. She deserves a better life than I can offer." Helena had volunteered to temporarily care for the child through a social program, but ended up falling in love with her and initiated the official adoption process. What most intrigued Edward was the chronology. Marina had been abandoned exactly when Helena disappeared from his life. Was it a coincidence, or was there a deeper connection? On Wednesday, Edward made a decision that surprised him. He decided to talk to Sophia about the situation, at least partially. "Princess," he said when she arrived from school, "would you like to see Marina again?" Sophia's eyes lit up immediately. "Seriously, Daddy? Can I invite her to come here to our house?" "Actually, I thought maybe we could visit her, see where she lives, meet her mother." Sophia jumped for joy. "That's great. When can we go?" Edward felt a pang in his chest. "How about Saturday? You could bring your violin and you could play together." Throughout the week, Edward oscillated between anxiety and a strange anticipation. Part of him was terrified of the inevitable confrontation with Helena. Another part, a part he had suppressed for years, felt a painful curiosity about how she was, if she ever thought of him, if she missed the life they had shared. On Friday night, Edward was in his room trying to decide what to wear the next day when Sophia knocked on the door. "Daddy, can I come in?" She sat on the bed beside him, swinging her legs the way she did when she was smaller. "Daddy, are you okay? You seem different this week." Edward looked at his daughter, impressed once again by her perceptiveness. "Why do you ask, Princess? You sometimes stare into space, as if you're thinking about very important things. And you smile less than usual." Edward felt a pang of guilt. He had been so absorbed in his own emotional complications that he had neglected the attention he owed Sophia. "You know, Princess, sometimes adults discover things that make them rethink many things about life." Sophia studied him with her serious blue eyes. "It's about Marina and her mother, isn't it?" The question caught Edward by surprise. "Ah, why do you think that?" "Because you've been strange since we met her in the square, and because—" Sophia hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "Marina told me something in the square after you went to buy us ice cream." Edward felt his heart race. "What did she say?" "She said her mom has an old photo of a man who looks like you, Daddy, and that her mom always gets sad when she looks at the photo, but she never wants to throw it away." The world seemed to stop around Edward. Helena had kept a photo of him. After all these years, after everything that had happened between them, she still held on to some memory of their relationship. "Daddy," Sophia continued, "Marina is very sad sometimes. She pretends she isn't, but I can tell. She worries a lot about her mom." Edward hugged Sophia, feeling a complex mix of pride for his daughter's emotional sensitivity and terror at the complexity of the situation they were getting involved in. Saturday would arrive in a few hours, and with it, answers to questions Edward wasn't sure he was prepared to hear. Saturday dawned cloudy, as if the sky reflected the emotional storm raging in Edward's heart. He had spent the night awake, mentally rehearsing what he would say when he saw Helena face to face for the first time in 6 years. Every scenario he imagined ended differently, from explosive arguments to impossible reconciliations. Sophia was radiant during breakfast, talking non-stop about how eager she was to show her house to Marina and to get to know her new friend's mother better. Edward watched her, marveling at children's ability to live in the present without torturing themselves with the complexities of the past. "Daddy, do you think Marina will like my room? And the music room?" Sophia asked, idly stirring her hot chocolate. "I'm sure she will, Princess." Edward forced a smile. "But remember, we'll go to her place first, then we'll talk about her coming here." The drive to St. Vincent's district felt simultaneously eternal and too fast. Sophia chattered in the back seat, but Edward barely heard her. His hands sweated on the steering wheel as he approached the address he had memorized during the week. When they parked in front of the old building, Edward had to hold himself back from putting the car in reverse and fleeing, but Sophia was already jumping out of the car, carrying her violin case with contagious enthusiasm. "Come on, Daddy. I can't wait to play with Marina." They climbed the narrow stairs to the third floor. Edward felt each step like a mountain he had to climb. The hallway smelled of cheap cleaner and homemade food, a mix of aromas that transported him to a time in his life when he didn't have enough money to worry about brands or status. Sophia knocked on the door of apartment 3B with 3 lively knocks. Slow footsteps approached from the other side. Edward heard a familiar voice, weaker than he remembered, asking who it was. "It's Sophia, Aunt Eleanor, and my daddy came too." The silence that followed lasted an eternity. Edward could imagine Helena on the other side of the door, processing what she had just heard, trying to decide whether or not to open it. The door opened slowly. Helena was even thinner than Edward had seen on the street during the week. Her face was pale, but her eyes were still the same ones he had loved so many years ago. For a moment, neither of them could speak. "Edward," she said finally, her voice a whisper full of contradictory emotions. "Hello, Helena." Marina appeared running behind Helena, her face lighting up when she saw Sophia. "Sophia, you came, and you brought your violin." "I did. Can we play together?" Sophia replied, seemingly oblivious to the palpable tension between the adults. Helena stepped back, making space for them to enter. "Please, come in. Excuse the... Well, I wasn't expecting visitors." The apartment was small but carefully tidied, simple but clean furniture, a few plants on the window trying to capture the little sun that managed to get through the nearby buildings. On the wall, Edward noticed several photos of Marina at different ages, and there, in a discreet corner, a small frame he recognized instantly. It was a photo of them together, taken one spring afternoon years ago, when they still believed that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. "Can I offer you coffee? Water?" Helena asked, her hands trembling slightly. "Coffee would be good," Edward replied, though he wasn't sure he could swallow anything. As Helena headed for the small kitchen, Sophia and Marina were already opening their violin cases, chattering about the songs they could play together. Edward stood in the living room, observing every detail, trying to understand how the woman he had loved so much had reached that point. There were music books stacked on an improvised table, handwritten scores scattered around, clear signs that Helena still taught, still struggled to keep her passion for music alive despite the circumstances. "Edward," Helena called from the kitchen, Could you come here for a moment?" He walked to the tiny kitchen, where Helena stood with her back to him, nervously stirring coffee. "Helena, She turned, and Edward saw tears in her eyes. "Why did you come here, Edward? After all these years, why now?" The question was simple, but laden with years of pain, longing, and resentment. Edward realized that all the answers he had rehearsed seemed inadequate in the face of the raw vulnerability he saw on Helena's face. "Because," he said slowly, "Marina plays our song." Helena dropped the spoon she was holding, and the metallic sound echoed through the small kitchen like a gunshot. Her eyes widened, and she leaned on the sink as if her legs had lost their strength. You heard her play our song." Helena's voice came out broken, laden with a guilt Edward couldn't comprehend. "Helena, how is it possible? How does a child you adopted 6 years ago know a composition you created specifically for me? A song that was never played for anyone else?" Helena closed her eyes, and Edward saw an internal struggle unfolding on her face. When she opened them again, there was a painful determination in her gaze. "Edward, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago, but—" She hesitated, looking towards the living room where the girls were laughing as they tuned their violins. "You need to sit down." Edward felt a cold knot in his stomach. "Helena, what's going on? Sit down. Please." Helena pulled a chair from the small kitchen table. Marina isn't just any child I adopted." Edward's heart began to pound wildly. "What do you mean?" Helena took a deep breath, like someone about to jump off a cliff. "Marina is my biological daughter, Edward, my real daughter." The world seemed to stop around Edward. "Your daughter? But the report said she was abandoned, that you adopted her." "I lied to the social workers. I created a false story to protect her." Tears began to roll down Helena's face. "Marina was born 2 years after our divorce. Her father didn't want to take responsibility, and I was alone, trying to rebuild my life." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. "You had another daughter and never told me. Helena, we were—" "No!" Helena interrupted him, her voice rising. "Edward, you don't understand. Marina isn't another man's daughter." The sentence hung in the air between them like a bomb about to explode. Edward blinked several times, trying to process what Helena had just said. "What do you mean?" His voice came out as a whisper. Helena was openly weeping now. "Edward, Marina is our daughter. Your daughter. Our daughter who was born after we separated, but who was conceived before the divorce was finalized." The floor seemed to disappear beneath Edward's feet. He clutched the table, feeling dizzy. "That's impossible. If she were my daughter, you would have told me. I found out I was pregnant 3 months after you left home," Helena said, sobbing. "Remember that last night we spent together before the final fight about work, about how we were drifting apart? I discovered the pregnancy when the divorce papers were already being processed." Edward felt as if he was in a terrible dream. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide this from me?" "Because you had made it very clear you wanted nothing more to do with me. Because when I tried to call you, your secretary said you had given orders not to accept my calls. Because you changed your address, your phone number, disappeared from my life as if I were a virus you needed to eliminate." Helena's words hit Edward like stabs. He remembered giving those instructions to his secretary, remembered moving to avoid any contact with Helena. At the time, he thought it was the only way to move on, not to succumb to the pain of the relationship that had ended. "Helena, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know, because you didn't want to know." Helena turned, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I tried, Edward. I tried several times to find a way to tell you, but you had built such a high wall around yourself that it was impossible to reach you." Edward looked towards the living room, where Marina, his daughter, was laughing with Sophia. Everything started to make sense now. The familiar eyes, the way she held the violin, the natural connection he had felt with her from the very first moment. Why doesn't she know?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Because I didn't want her to grow up feeling rejected by a father who didn't even know of her existence. I told her her father had died before she was born." Helena wiped her face with a dishcloth. "And because part of me was afraid that if you found out, you'd try to take her away from me." Edward remained silent for several minutes, listening to the sound of the 2 girls playing violin in the living room. His mind tried to reorder 6 years of life in light of this devastating revelation. "Edward," Helena said softly, "I know this is a lot to process at once, but now that you know, what do you plan to do?" Edward remained silent for long minutes, trying to absorb the magnitude of the revelation. His mind alternated between anger, guilt, sadness, and an overwhelming confusion that threatened to destroy all the certainties he had built about his life in recent years. 6 years, he murmured, more to himself than to Helena. 6 lost years. 6 years in which my daughter grew up without knowing who I was, in which she endured hardships I could have prevented. Helena flinched slightly. "Edward, you took away my right to be her father from birth." Edward's voice rose, laden with a pain he could no longer contain. "You decided alone that I didn't deserve to know I had another daughter." "Lower your voice, please," Helena pleaded, looking nervously towards the living room. "The girls." Edward ran his hands through his hair, trying to control himself. From the other room came the sounds of Spring's Tears being played as a duet, the 2 girls laughing when one missed a note and starting again together. The contrast between the musical harmony and the emotional chaos in the kitchen was almost surreal. "How is she?" Edward asked, his voice dropping to a tense whisper. "Medically, I mean, you look sick." Helena lowered her eyes. "I have an autoimmune condition that developed 3 years ago. Nothing fatal, but it leaves me weak, prevents me from working regularly. That's why Marina plays on the street. She insists on helping with expenses." Guilt hit Edward like an avalanche. While he was accumulating millions, his daughter was playing violin on the streets to buy medicine for her sick mother. "Why didn't you seek help? There are social programs. Aid." "I tried, but the bureaucracy is complicated, and I have my pride too, Edward. It's not easy to admit I can't take care of my own daughter." Edward looked out the small kitchen window, seeing the building's inner courtyard where colorful clothes dried on the line. It was a completely different world from his, but it was the world where his daughter had grown up. "What does she know about me?" Edward asked. "I told her some stories. I told her her father loved music as much as we did, that he was a good man but had to leave before she was born." Helena hesitated. "I showed her some photos of us from when we were happy." Edward remembered what Sophia had mentioned about Marina having seen a photo of him. "Does she know it's me, that the man in the photo is Sophia's father?" "I don't know. She's a smart child. Maybe she suspected something when you showed up here today, but we never talked about it directly." The sound of the violin stopped in the living room, followed by Sophia's enthusiastic clapping. "Daddy! Aunt Eleanor! You have to come listen. Marina taught me a new variation of the song." Edward and Helena exchanged glances, both realizing they needed to compose themselves quickly to avoid raising the children's suspicions. "We're coming," Helena replied, trying to disguise her choked voice. When they returned to the living room, Edward saw Marina with new eyes. Every gesture, every facial expression revealed similarities he had unconsciously noticed but hadn't been able to identify. The way she bit her lip when she was concentrating was identical to what Sophia did. The way she held the violin bow was a mirror of his own technique. "Daddy, sit here." Sophia patted the spot beside her on the small sofa. "Marina is going to play a song she invented herself." Marina stood in the center of the living room, her old but well-cared-for violin shining in the afternoon light. She looked at Edward with a mix of shyness and anticipation. "This song," she said in her sweet voice, "I made it thinking about the father I never knew. Mom said he would like to hear me play it." Edward felt tears threaten to overflow. His daughter had composed a song for him, for the father she never knew was alive and just a few miles away. Marina began to play, and the melody that flowed from the old violin was of devastating beauty. It was a simple but deeply emotional composition, full of longing and hope at the same time. Edward recognized in it echoes of spring's tears, but transformed by the innocent perspective of a child who dreamed of an idealized father. When Marina finished, the silence in the room was heavy with emotions that none of the adults knew how to express. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," Sophia said, clapping enthusiastically. "Marina, you're amazing. Daddy, isn't she amazing?" Edward had to clear his throat before he could speak. It's very beautiful, Marina. You have extraordinary talent." Marina smiled timidly, putting the violin back in its worn case. "Thanks. Mom helped me with some chords, but I invented the main melody myself." Helena watched the scene with teary eyes, seeing father and daughter interacting without Marina knowing their true connection. Edward noticed Helena's gaze and felt a complex mixture of gratitude and resentment. Gratitude for her raising such a talented and sensitive daughter, resentment for having been deprived of participating in that process. "Marina," Edward said, his voice still a little hoarse, "would you like to show me where you and your mom live? Sophia told me you have interesting music books." "Of course!" Marina jumped up excitedly. "Mom has very old sheet music. Some she copied by hand when she was studying at the conservatory." As Marina guided Sophia through the apartment's 2 small rooms, showing her belongings with the simple pride of a child who values every object, Edward watched Helena tidying the living room table. "Helena," he said softly, "we need to talk about the future, about how we're going to handle this situation." Helena stopped arranging the sheet music and stared at him. "What do you mean? Marina is my daughter. I have responsibilities towards her, rights too. I can't just pretend I don't know and walk away." "Edward, please, think carefully before making any rash decisions. Marina has a structured life here. She's known me as her mother for 6 years." "A structured life?" Edward interrupted her, trying to keep his voice low. "Helena, she plays violin on the street to buy food. That's not a structured life. It's survival." Helena flinched slightly but maintained her dignity. "We manage. She's a happy child, Edward. Look at her. She smiles, she laughs, she has friends at school. And she could have so much more," Edward retorted. "Quality education, private tutors, a new violin, financial security. Money isn't everything, Edward. You should know that better than anyone." The remark hit Edward like a slap across the face. It was true that he had learned, especially after the divorce, that all his wealth had not managed to fill the emotional void he carried. From the bedroom came Marina's voice. "Sophia, want to see Mum's violin, the one she had to sell?" "She sold her violin?" Sophia asked, and Edward heard the genuine sadness in his daughter's voice. "She had to sell it when I got very sick 2 years ago," Marina explained naturally. "But it's okay, because I could use this one. And she said music doesn't need an expensive instrument to be beautiful." Edward closed his eyes, feeling a physical pain in his chest. His daughter had a maturity and acceptance of difficulties that deeply humbled him. While he worried about investments and profits, she had learned lessons about values and priorities that had taken him decades to understand. "Helena," he said, his voice softer now, "I'm not trying to take Marina from you. I would never do that. But I need to be a part of her life somehow. I need to make up for lost time." Helena studied him for a long moment. "And how do you intend to do that without revealing who you really are? Marina will ask questions if you suddenly appear in her life as a paternal figure." Edward had no immediate answer for that. How to explain to a 9-year-old child that the father she thought was dead was alive and had spent the last years living a luxurious life just a few miles away? Maybe we can start slow," he suggested. "As a family friend. Sophia has already formed a bond with Marina. That would be natural. And then we'll see. Maybe there will come a time when she's ready to know the truth." Helena nodded slowly. "Edward, if you truly want to be part of her life, You need to understand that it can't just be when it's convenient for you. You can't show up for a few weeks and then disappear again. Marina has already experienced enough abandonment." "I understand," Edward said, though he wasn't sure if he truly understood the full extent of the commitment he was making. Sophia and Marina returned to the living room, carrying an old photo album. "Aunt Eleanor, can I show Daddy the photos of when Marina was a baby?" Sophia asked. Edward felt his heart race. Seeing photos of baby Marina would mean seeing records of moments in his daughter's life from which he had been completely excluded. "Of course," Helena replied, though Edward noticed the hesitation in her voice. Marina opened the album on the coffee table, and Edward approached. The first photo showed a small baby in Helena's arms, both in a simple hospital room. Edward recognized Helena immediately, though she looked younger and more fragile than he remembered. "This is when I was born," Marina explained proudly. "Mom said I was a very quiet baby, who hardly ever cried." Edward looked at the photo, seeing his newborn daughter for the first time 6 years after her birth. An overwhelming emotion overcame him, a mix of instant love and irreparable loss that left him speechless. Over the next 2 weeks, Edward found himself in a completely new routine. For the first time in years, he cancelled business meetings to spend Saturday afternoons at Helena and Marina's small apartment. Officially, he was helping Sophia develop a healthy friendship. In reality, every moment there was a precious opportunity to get to know the daughter whose first 6 years of life he had missed. Edward discovered that Marina was a fascinating child. She had a natural curiosity about everything, asking questions that often caught him off guard. One afternoon, while helping Helena glue sheet music, Marina asked, "Mr. Edward, why do you get sad sometimes when I play the violin?" The question left him speechless for several seconds. "I'm not sad, Marina. I'm moved. Your music reminds me of important things." "What kind of things?" Edward looked at Helena, who was pretending to concentrate on the sheet music, but clearly listening to every word of the conversation. "It reminds me that music has the power to connect people, even when they are far apart." Marina nodded seriously, as if she perfectly understood what he meant. "Mum always says that when I play, it's like I'm talking to people I can't see." The girl's simple wisdom constantly surprised Edward. She had developed a philosophy of life that many adults took decades to achieve, if they ever did. During the 3rd week, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He offered to pay for a private violin tutor for Marina, not as charity, he quickly explained when he saw the expression of wounded pride on Helena's face. As an investment in the talent of an exceptional child, Sophia would also benefit from having lessons with Marina. Helena hesitated for several days before accepting, "But the lessons have to be here, at home. I don't want Marina to feel out of place in environments very different from hers," Edward agreed, although that meant transforming the apartment's small living room into an improvised music studio. He hired Professor August, the same one who taught Sophia at the conservatory, for weekly home sessions. The first joint lesson was a revelation. Edward watched, fascinated, as Marina and Sophia played a simplified version of a classical duet together. The difference in their techniques was striking. Sophia had technical precision and formal discipline, but Marina had something that couldn't be taught, a deep emotional connection to every note. "Marina has an impressive natural gift," Professor August commented to Edward after the lesson. "In 6 months, with proper training, she could be playing pieces that took Sophia years to master." Edward felt a paternal pride he didn't know could exist. His daughter was not only talented, she was exceptionally talented. It was that same week that Marina asked a question that changed everything. They were organizing the sheet music after a lesson when Marina casually said, "Mr. Edward, you remind me of someone." Edward felt his heart race. "I do?" "Yes, you hold the bow the same way I do. And when you smile—" Marina hesitated, as if trying to organize her thoughts. You smile just like the man in the photo Mom keeps. The silence in the room was absolute. Helena dropped the sheet music she was holding. Sophia stopped tidying her violin, and Edward felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. "What photo, dear?" Helena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The photo of my dad, the one you keep in your bedroom drawer but think I haven't seen." Marina looked innocently from Edward to Helena. "Mom, why did you never tell me you knew Sophia's daddy?" Edward saw Helena turn drastically pale. Marina's seemingly simple question had exposed a truth they had carefully tried to hide. "Marina, dear," Helena began, but her voice failed. Sophia, who had been following the conversation with growing surprise, suddenly exclaimed, "Marina, you think my daddy looks like your daddy in the photo?" Marina nodded, still not understanding why the adults seemed so disturbed. "Very similar, in fact." She tilted her head, studying Edward carefully. "Sometimes I think they're the same person." Edward felt he had reached a point of no return. Marina's natural innocence had discovered in a few weeks what they thought they could hide indefinitely. He looked at Helena, seeing in her eyes the same panic he felt. It was time to decide: continue lying to a child who was clearly too smart to be deceived, or find a way to reveal a truth that would change everyone's lives forever. Edward spent the entire night walking the corridors of his mansion, unable to sleep. Marina's words echoed in his mind. "Sometimes I think they're the same person." The innocence with which she had said it made everything more devastating. His daughter was starting to unravel a mystery on her own that the adults around her had created to protect her. The next morning, Edward called Helena. "Ed, we need to talk, without the children." Helena reluctantly agreed to meet him at a small cafe near her home. When Edward arrived, she was already there, nervously stirring a cup of coffee she seemed not to have touched. "Helena, we can't put off this conversation any longer," Edward said, sitting opposite her. "Marina is making connections. She's too smart a child for us to keep lying to her." "I know." Helena sighed deeply. "I stayed awake all night thinking about it. But Edward, how do we explain to a 9-year-old child that the father she thought was dead has been alive for 6 years and didn't know she existed?" "By telling the truth, carefully, with love, but the truth." Helena looked up to meet his eyes. "And then, Marina will want to know why you never looked for her, why you let us live in hardship while you had the resources to help. How do we explain that?" Edward felt the weight of familial guilt on his shoulders. "We explain that it was a terrible misunderstanding, that I didn't know she existed, but now that I do, I want to be a part of her life. What if she doesn't want to? And what if she gets angry because we lied all these years? It's a risk we'll have to take." Edward reached his hand across the table, lightly touching Helena's. "But continuing to lie is worse. Marina deserves to know who her father is." Helena remained silent for several minutes, watching the movement of people on the street through the cafe window. "There's one more thing you need to know before we decide to tell her the truth," Helena finally said. Edward felt a cold knot in his stomach. "What? My health condition? It's getting worse. The doctors think I need more aggressive treatment, which might leave me debilitated for a few months. If something happened to me, Marina would be alone." The revelation hit Edward like a lightning bolt. "Helena, why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I didn't want you to feel obligated to care for Marina out of pity or guilt. I wanted it to be a genuine choice." Edward fell silent, processing the information. If Helena became incapacitated, Marina would need constant care, and there was no one else in their lives who could take on that responsibility. "When do you need to start treatment?" "Next week." Edward ran his hands through his hair, feeling the immense weight of the situation. "Helena, regardless of the treatment, Marina needs to know the truth. She has the right to know her father before anything happens." Helena nodded slowly. "You're right. But Edward, promise me one thing." "What?" "If we're going to tell her the truth, it has to be forever." It can't just be until I recover and you decide your life was simpler without these complications. Marina has already experienced enough abandonment. Edward looked into Helena's eyes and saw the woman he had loved years ago, the mother who had fought alone to raise their daughter with dignity despite all the hardships. I promise, Marina is my daughter, Helena. I will never abandon her again. They decided to tell the truth the following Saturday, when both girls would be together at the apartment. Edward spent the next few days mentally rehearsing how he would explain the situation, but every phrase he formulated seemed inadequate for the magnitude of the revelation. Saturday arrived sunny, as if the universe ironically decided to create a cheerful backdrop for one of the most difficult conversations of Edward's life. When he arrived at the apartment, Marina ran to open the door as she always did. "Mr. Edward, Sophia isn't here yet, but Mom said we can play while we wait." Edward smiled, seeing his daughter so animated and innocent, without imagining that her life was about to change completely. "Marina, sweetie," Edward said, crouching down to be at her level. "Before we play, your mother and I need to talk to you about something very important." Marina tilted her head, curious. "About what?" Edward looked at Helena, who nodded encouragingly. "About who I really am." Marina looked from Edward to Helena, her large eyes showing more curiosity than concern. "About who you really are. Aren't you Edward, Sophia's daddy?" Edward felt as if he was on the edge of a cliff, about to jump without knowing if there was a safety net below. Helena approached and sat on the sofa, motioning for Marina to sit beside her. "Marina, sweetie," Helena began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'd remember when you asked me about your father, and I told you he had passed away before you were born." Marina nodded, still not understanding where the conversation was heading. "Well, we didn't tell you the whole truth." Helena took Marina's small hands in hers. "Your father didn't die, Marina. He just didn't know you existed." Marina frowned, trying to process the information. "Didn't know I existed? What do you mean?" Edward slowly approached, feeling each heartbeat like a drum in his ears. "Marina, do you remember the photo your mother keeps? The photo of the man you said looks like me?" "Yes," Marina replied hesitantly, beginning to understand that something very important was happening. "That man in the photo is me, Marina. I am your father." The silence that followed was absolute. Marina looked from Edward to Helena, then back to Edward, as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. "You're my daddy." Her voice came out as a whisper. "Yes, sweetie, I am your daddy." Marina remained motionless for several seconds, processing the revelation. Then, to Edward's surprise, she neither cried nor screamed. Instead, she asked with the simple logic of a child, "But why did Mom say you had died?" Helena took a deep breath. "Because when I found out I was expecting you, your father and we weren't together anymore, and he had changed his address. His phone number disappeared from my life. I tried to find him to tell him about you, but I couldn't. And Edward added, his voice laden with remorse, "I was so angry and hurt by the end of our relationship that I told my secretary not to accept calls from your mother. I built walls around myself and ended up preventing her from telling me about you." Marina slowly absorbed the information. "So you two didn't abandon me on purpose?" "Never." "Sweetie," Edward said, kneeling before her, "if I had known you existed, I would have been by your side from day one." Marina remained quiet for several minutes, looking at her own hands. Edward and Helena waited in agonizing silence, unsure of the girl's reaction. Finally, Marina looked up at Edward. Can I call you Daddy?" Edward felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Of course you can, my daughter. Of course you can." Marina slowly stood up and walked to Edward. She hugged him hesitantly at first, then more tightly as he enveloped her in his arms. "Daddy," she murmured against his chest, "are you going to leave again?" "Never again, Marina. I'll never leave you again." It was at that moment that Sophia arrived. Running through the door Helena had left ajar. She stopped in the middle of the living room, looking at the scene before her with surprise. "Marina, why are you crying? Did something happen?" Marina pulled away slightly from Edward, but continued holding his hand. "Sophia, I found out something amazing. Your daddy is my daddy too." Sophia's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "We're sisters, Sophia, real sisters." Sophia looked from Marina to Edward, trying to understand. "Daddy, is it true?" Edward nodded, extending his free arm to Sophia. "It's true, princess. Marina is your sister." Sophia ran to join the hug, and Edward found himself enveloped by both daughters, feeling a completeness he had never experienced before. "Does that mean," Sophia said excitedly, "that Marina can come live with us now, and we can play violin together every day?" Edward looked at Helena over the girls' heads. They hadn't yet discussed the practical aspects of the situation, but Edward knew that, regardless of the details, his life had changed irreversibly. "We'll talk about all of that," Edward said. "But the important thing is that now we are a family." Marina looked up and smiled through her tears. "A real family. A real family," Edward confirmed, finally understanding what that word truly meant. The next 2 months were an emotional roller coaster of adjustments, discoveries, and the healing of old wounds. Edward insisted that Helena immediately begin appropriate medical treatment at a top-tier private clinic, assuming all costs without accepting arguments. "It's not charity, Helena," he said when she tried to protest. "It's responsibility. Marina needs a healthy mother, and I need you to be well too." During the weeks Helena was hospitalized for intensive treatment, Marina stayed at Edward's mansion. The adjustment was not easy. The girl, accustomed to the simplicity of the small apartment, initially felt lost in the enormous rooms and luxuries that Edward considered normal. "Daddy," Marina said one morning, finding Edward in his office, "can I sleep in Sophia's room? My room is too big, and I get scared at night." Edward realized there was much more to being a father than simply providing material comfort. Marina needed emotional security, human closeness, constant affection, things money couldn't buy. Sophia became the perfect bridge between the two worlds. She helped Marina adapt to the new reality, while unconsciously teaching Edward to be more flexible and less controlling. Seeing the two girls share a room, creating a bond of true sisters, Edward understood that family wasn't about rigid rules, but about mutual adaptation and unconditional love. The most challenging moment came when Marina had her first bout of homesickness for Helena and the simple life she knew. Edward found her crying in the garden one afternoon, holding the old violin against her chest. "I want to go home, Daddy. I want my small house. I want Mom. I want everything back the way it was." Edward sat beside her on the grass, remembering how Helena used to comfort him years ago when he was stressed with work. "Marina, can I tell you a secret?" She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "When I was a kid, I also lived in a small house. And guess what? Some of my happiest memories were in that small house, not this big one. Really, really, home isn't about size, it's about love. And now, wherever you are, here, at Mom's small house or anywhere else, you'll have love, because you have a family that loves you." Marina snuggled against him. "Can I play a song for Mom, so she can hear it even though she's far away?" Edward smiled. "Of course you can." They started a tradition. Every night before bed, Marina would play a song thinking of Helena. Edward discovered that these musical sessions became moments of deep connection with his daughter, where they talked about everything: fears, dreams, longings, and hopes. When Helena finally returned home 3 weeks later, her recovery was surprising the doctors. The treatment had been successful, and she was visibly stronger and healthier. "Edward," she said when they met alone for the first time since the treatment began, "I don't know how to thank you, not just for the treatment, but for taking such loving care of Marina. Helena, you don't need to thank me. Marina is my daughter, as much as she is yours. Caring for her isn't a favor, it's a responsibility and a joy." Helena smiled, and Edward saw in that smile an echo of the woman he had fallen in love with years ago. "Edward, we need to talk about the future, about how we're going to organize our lives going forward." Edward had thought a lot about this in the preceding weeks. "Helena, I have a proposal. How about you and Marina move into the house next to mine? I had it completely renovated. It's the ideal size for the two of you, but close enough for Marina and Sophia to spend time together daily." Helena studied him carefully. "Ooh, why not at your house?" "Because Marina needs a home that is hers and yours. She needs to maintain her identity, her connection with you as her primary mother. I want to be her father, but I don't want to replace or diminish what you've built together." Helena closed her eyes, and Edward saw tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding, for respecting our history." "Helena," Edward said softly, "we made many mistakes in the past. But Marina has given us a second chance to be a family, even if in a different way than we imagined. I won't waste this chance." That night, the two girls played violin together in the garden of Helena and Marina's new house. Edward and Helena watched them from a distance, two adults who had learned that love sometimes needs to be reinvented to include new possibilities for happiness. 6 months after that first encounter in the town square, Edward sat in the front row of the city auditorium, his heart beating with pride and emotion. On stage, illuminated by golden spotlights, Marina and Sophia played a duet they had composed themselves, a perfect fusion of spring's tears with original melodies that represented their individual journeys until they became sisters. The auditorium was packed for the Music for All charity performance, a community outreach project Edward had founded 3 months prior. The idea had emerged from a conversation with Marina about the other children she knew from the streets, talented kids who played makeshift instruments or sang for coins. "Daddy," Marina had said, "if I hadn't found you and Sophia in that square, I'd still be playing alone. And there are so many kids who play better than me and will never get the chance to show everyone." This simple observation had planted a seed in Edward's mind. In a matter of weeks, he had transformed an old warehouse downtown into a community music center, where children from all walks of life could learn music for free. Helena had become the pedagogical director, using her experience and passion for teaching to create a curriculum that combined classical technique with creative expression. The project grew rapidly. Edward's business associates contributed instruments and resources. Volunteer teachers offered to give lessons, and families from all over the city began enrolling their children. But the most gratifying thing for Edward was seeing children like Marina, talented but without opportunities, discovering that their musical voices had value and deserved to be heard. On stage, Marina and Sophia finished the duet with perfect harmony, prompting the entire auditorium to erupt in enthusiastic applause. Edward felt tears of pride stream down his face as his two daughters bowed elegantly to the audience. After the performance, backstage, Edward hugged both girls. "You were absolutely perfect," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Daddy," Marina said, still radiant from the performance's adrenaline, "did you see how much the audience liked it? I think our music really touched people's hearts." Sophia nodded animatedly. "And the part we added at the end. When we played thinking of all the children still on the streets, I think everyone understood the message." Edward looked at his daughters, marveling at the emotional maturity and social awareness they had developed. Marina, who a year ago played on the streets out of necessity, now used her music as a tool for social transformation. Sophia, who once viewed music merely as an elegant educational obligation, had discovered the power of art as a form of human connection and social change. Helena approached, carrying a bouquet of flowers someone from the audience had sent for the girls. "Edward," she said, "did you see the news report that came out today about the project?" Edward shook his head. In recent weeks, he had been so focused on the performance preparations that he barely kept up with the news. Helena showed him her phone with the article. The headline read, "Businessman Ignites Music Revolution. Community Music Center Transforms Lives in the City." They interviewed 10 families, Helena explained. All of them told how the project changed their children's lives. One mother said her son stopped getting into trouble at school after he started playing drums. Another said her daughter, who was very shy, became more confident after singing lessons. Edward read a few excerpts from the article, feeling a deep satisfaction that was completely different from the pleasure he used to feel from business successes. It was a satisfaction that came from knowing he was making a real difference in the lives of actual children, not just accumulating numbers in bank accounts. "You know what's even more amazing?" Helena continued. "They estimated that in 6 months, the project has already directly impacted over 200 children and their families." Marina tugged on Edward's suit sleeve. "Daddy, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, my daughter." "Remember when I was playing in the town square and you showed up that day?" Edward nodded, vividly remembering that moment that had changed everything. "I wasn't just playing for money. I was playing because I felt someone special needed to hear me. And when you stopped and got that strange look on your face, I knew it was you." Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. "How did you know?" Marina smiled with the mysterious wisdom that sometimes surprised adults. "Because music never lies, Daddy. When we truly play, we call the right people into our lives." Edward hugged Marina, understanding that his daughter had grasped something about music, life, and destiny that he was only just beginning to learn. Later that night, after the girls had gone to sleep, Edward and Helena sat in the garden between their 2 houses, listening to the soft sound of the fountain he had installed. "Edward," Helena said softly, "you know we achieved something very rare, don't you?" "What?" "We transformed a story that could have been about regret and lost opportunities into a story about second chances and families reinventing themselves." Edward nodded, looking at the illuminated windows of the girls' rooms. "Helena, can I ask you a question I've been wanting to ask for months?" "Of course." "Do you forgive me for being so proud, so closed off, for having missed Marina's first years?" Helena was silent for a moment, then smiled. "Edward, there's nothing to forgive. We both made mistakes. We both learned, and we both grew. What matters is what we do from now on." Edward smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He looked at the town square in the distance, where everything had begun, and knew that sometimes the best stories aren't about perfect endings, but about unexpected beginnings that teach us it's never too late to discover what truly matters. Music had reunited a family. Love had healed old wounds. And 2 girls had proven that sometimes it's children who teach adults the most important lessons about courage, forgiveness, and the beauty of creating perfect harmonies from notes that seem destined to never meet.